Hello and welcome to Bot Populi. Bot Populi is an alternative media platform dedicated to looking at all things digital from a social justice and global south perspective. We're now also a podcast. I'm your host Tanvi Kanchan, and you're joining us for episode 2 of the Davos Diaries. Today, we'll be exploring the idea of multi-stakeholder governance and how large transnational corporations are influencing global governance through spaces like the World Economic Forum. We'll also be taking a look at how big tech has entered these spaces and how that's impacted multilateralism and global policy. But before we get into that, let's first understand exactly what the multi-stakeholder model is. Harris Gleckman breaks down the history and concept of multi-stakeholderism.
Transnational corporations expanded significantly after the end of the Second World War. And from the end of the Second World War, in the late 1940s, to probably the 1980s, multinationals and national firms lobbied, pressured their own governments about views that those governments should take in support of their international businesses, whether it was on the military side or on the policy side. And they pressured their governments, and those governments could reflect those views in international fora. What has changed starting in the early 1990s and more up to the 2000s was that some of those firms switched from trying to indirectly influence global policy to directly wanting to be at the place where global policies were being formulated and programs were being formulated and decisions were being made. But being directly involved as a lobbyist, to go at international events, to speak to the delegates and to the civil society at those events and meetings, wasn't enough. And now what is happening is that multi-stakeholder governance becomes the form. As I indicated, multi-stakeholder governance has a central group of 1, 2, or 3 multinationals or transnationals, where they invite their friends from governments, from civil society, academics, media, to take on an issue. And those issues that they take on are cutting-edge issues in global affairs, often ones with a very strong economic base, and ones in the area of social matters, technological matters, environmental and economic matters. And they carve off those issues and say that we will be doing this work. Now, how do they make this happen? Partly because some of the friendly governments who are participating as governments in the multilateral system say, let's see what happens out of this arrangement. Sometimes it's done by the civil society organizations who say, wait a minute, we're working on this directly with the powerful, leave it alone. On other occasions, it's the multilateral system, frankly, who says, we're going to step back. Somebody else is doing this. It's too risky for us to get into this. We'll let others do it. So you have a conscious engagement and you have an informal withdrawal of the multilateral system that's allowing multi-stakeholder groups to set the terrain for how, on policies, on standard setting, and on project delivery, the tough new issues are being addressed.
Harris further explains that there are actually 3 types of multi-stakeholder groups. The first type, like the WEF, evolves policy. The second type sets global standards for products and processes with minimal involvement from public bodies and civil society. The third type, and perhaps the largest segment, is project-oriented multi-stakeholder groups, more commonly known as public-private partnerships. Jim Thomas believes that the WEF is now trying to bring this cozy club of multi-stakeholderism to the world by curating a set of pro-corporate voices. He gives the example of food systems to illustrate this.
I think what's very interesting and what's now coming out of Davos, is taking that model and trying to bring it into governance right across international governance spaces. And the World Economic Forum will talk about multistakeholderism. If you can have a sort of cozy collaboration between the stakeholders of industry, of government, and of a sort of chosen part of civil society, then that could govern and make space for the kind of changes the World Economic Forum sees and wants to accelerate, particularly around the digitization and the fourth industrial revolution. And so what we're now seeing, and this is probably the more worrying thing, is less the meeting in Davos, which is kind of what it's always been, although it's online now because of the pandemic, but more the attempt to bring that multi-stakeholderism, that kind of cozy club, to governance spaces that previously had really been much more open to civil society, that really had a more democratic cast. Well, the fallout is that you move away from 50 years, or I think it's now 75 years, of UN built up practice of one member, one vote, of opening up spaces increasingly to civil society, social movements, indigenous movements, to be part of the global discussion on governance. So, and instead end up with a sort of carefully managed, carefully orchestrated set of pro-corporate voices who will open the way for the kind of transformations that help corporations. So the place, one place we can see this very clearly is what's happening in food systems, and I think we can talk a little bit to that, and how there's a deliberate attempt really coming from the World Economic Forum, but also from some large philanthrocapitalists, like the Gates Foundation, to change the way that food is managed in a really quite undemocratic way.
This begs the question, why has the multi-stakeholder model gained prominence over the multilateral system? Barbara Adams believes it has something to do with the growing lack of trust in the capabilities of the state and multilateral bodies like the United Nations at large.
I think the first thing we have to bring into the picture with this kind of conversation is that the trust deficit doesn't apply only to the corporate sector, it also applies to the public sector. Whether it applies to the public sector because it seems to have abdicated or been unable to do its job in the interests of the provision of essential public services and the protection of people's rights, some people debate. But one of the things that we can't ignore is that a lot of protests around the world, a lot of calling for transformative change, for example, as well as focus on more single issue causes, a lot of that is directed to the failure of the state. And it is a difficult discussion to have right now to say that the solution is to strengthen the state. And one of the things about the COVID and about the situation that we're in at the moment is that it has not only, it's exposed and it's exacerbated the way in which in many cases the state is eroding a whole variety of rights and freedom of speech, and accompanied by something that's been going on for a long time, the degree of surveillance in the interests of security, of individuals, of organizing, of people. So it's a difficult kind of conversation because of this whole question of trust and how one would re-establish. One can't just take it for granted. One of the things I'm surprised to hear myself saying this. One of the things I prefer in the language of the Great Reset, which I don't particularly like as words, is that it's a lot better than Build Back Better, because of the recognition that the back, we don't want it back. Transparency assumes, if that's your only strategy, which does tend to accompany this whole stakeholder approach, the thinking is, if we just knew what was going on, we could work to change it. We do know what's going on, and it's not easy to change. And some sectors of society, some stakeholders have more ability, more interest, more resources to engage, and others don't. And those that are politically disenfranchised are not the stakeholders that get around the table to be able to be part of a multi-stakeholder approach to something better. They have been tossed into the space of so-called beneficiaries, and the accountability of them when they organize to make sure that the quote-unquote benefits reflect what they want just isn't there. In a state sector, you have some sense of accountability. How effective it is, we'll all debate. With this kind of an approach, who are the stakeholders? It's a self-selected group. It's based on a win-win mentality. It ignores, there is nothing in a stakeholder engagement that deals with conflict of interest. There are no eligibility criteria. There are no exclusion criteria. It's, do you want to join this initiative? It's a completely different approach to the concept that people have human rights. And there is a responsibility out there, whether you ask for it or not, to have your rights protected.
Renata Avila's view is that this shift hasn't occurred just because of a difference in perception, but also because of a lack of coordinated strategies and systems on the part of civil society. She uses the example of digital policy to illustrate this.
I think that we as civil society, especially in the digital space, we lack a coordinated strategy, and we are spread too thin, super specialized and spread too thin. And somehow the United Nations, that before, before it spent a long time completely, I will not address digital. Now digital is everywhere in the system. And it's impossible to follow up, it's impossible. It's not a strategy. Their digital strategy is not a strategy that is welcoming civil society at all to shape it, because it's spread to thin. It's happening at the same time in so many fora that we can barely keep up with what's going on. And I think that. To have a real influence in the multilateral system, for states even, we need to re-engineer the process that how this policy is made, because now I am not telling you lies, just in these inclusive algorithms, I have to attend meetings at ITU and then World Trade Organization, and then UN Women, and then UNICEF, and then UNESCO, and it all is a mess, and everybody's talking different things in each fora. So I don't know what will be the solution. I think that I can only think of a multilateral treaty that addresses all once and for all, like Marco Civil did in Brazil, that addresses once and for all the digital frame globally outside the sphere of commerce. And that would be like the only way to organize the party. And in the meantime, the only thing that we can do is, now it's very difficult because we're in different time zones, in different geographies, and really constrained by the virus. I think that a sensible thing to do towards 2021 is to convey key actors in civil society and split the cake, basically. Say, for example, IT for Change and Access will take care of ITU. Can I split the areas of competence and report back every month? Because and head to the same direction, agree on a common direction, civil society. Because if all of us want to be at the same time in the same fora, it's going to be very difficult. But the problem is that we as civil society, we are very different as well. There are those who think that Davos is the best place in the world, and those who think that is the devil itself, for example. Those who think that the United Nations is the best place in the world, and those who think that it should disappear. even inside our civil society. So it is complex to come up with a common agenda and a common direction of work. But even if it disperses, I still think that the multilateral system is very powerful and very influential. And the more close to civil society it is, the more dangerous it is. So the meetings that we don't get invites to, those are the meetings we should be attending and monitoring, actually.
What happens when large transnational corporations have the ear of elected representatives, like at Davos, and position themselves as equal stakeholders in matters of global governance? Policies are then framed with a view to safeguarding the profits and prominence of such companies, rather than in the interests of public good. Yoke Ling has some examples of how this happens, especially when it comes to big tech and the WEF's idea of agile governance.
I think in a way, it is a bubble in the sense that they create a bubble to bring in the people they want to influence. And then of course then there are lots of people, who are there to make up the numbers, but they're quite targeted because what they do is they create the forum, all right? Of course, this is only one, which is more visible actually. It happens in so many other places where you have this kind of, convening the marketplace really to influence policy thinking, right? Because it's really the thinking that, and then when you meet these guys, they're really nice and you have nice, well, I was told the food wasn't good, so I can't even say good food. You have wines and receptions and it's very glamorous, you see. So this bubble is a lulling of critical thinking, right? It really is although we do know the big tech, for example, and many of these big companies, the CEOs can just fly in and go straight to see, any of our heads of states, right? And that is actually, it wasn't so easy before. And I think places like Davos and the WEF forum, they create that camaraderie, so that next time I want to call them and say, I'm in town, right? And then even when they retire and make all the money from monopoly, like Bill Gates, right? Honestly, countries like Malaysia and China, we backed away from open source because we were threatened that the investment of the Microsoft plants will be taken out of Malaysia. Okay, this is public knowledge. And then when he has made all the money and he's so rich, then he wants to continue having tax exemption, and to save the world, he becomes, Gates Foundation. And he still flies in and sees the heads of state straight away, right? So I think it is very, so we have actually, not we, but I think the responsibility of governance at the public level, the political structure, all over, not just in the South, they have been lulled in different bubbles to think that these are our friends and they will help us to solve the problem, okay? Because in their hands are technology, in their hands are money. And why do they have a monopoly on money and technology? Because we created rules to allow them to do that. We have created rules to allow the financial accumulation, and we have created intellectual property rules to give them monopoly over technology. It's not as if some of these technology which are locked up in all kinds of intellectual property like patents or trade secrets or copyright, that nobody else can in the world have the ability to do it. No, you create monopoly. This is an established fact, which is why, India and South Africa in the COVID situation have gone to the WTO to say we need to have a waiver, suspend the implementation of the agreement on intellectual property for COVID products. We never thought this would happen. Why do they say that? Because they recognize 100 countries are supporting this. The reality of COVID shows us that the intellectual property regime is against public health. And I think this whole thing about resetting is the language of people. Transformation, structural change. Suddenly they're resetting, but they're resetting to actually have business as usual with very nice words. If I look at the website of WEF for their what did they say? Agile tech regulation. Agile tech regulation is a very clever term. It means deregulation, don't regulate. Leave it lawless as it is, and when you have regulation, deregulate. And they call it agile technology regulation. So I think we need to really just demystify, and we need to, I don't want to go and engage them. I want to go to all our countries, to all our government politicians and businesses who go to these meetings, Davos and others, and say, look, guys, you're being led up a path that's very bad, and your business is not going to benefit, and your country, if our politicians go, and they go, it's not going to benefit.
Roberto Bissio's view is that this corporate capture has also come about because bodies like the UN have left the door open to transnational companies to get involved.
A lot is being written about corporate capture of institutions like the United Nations. If we look at what actually happened, it could also be read as the United Nations saying, hey, come and capture me. Actually, it was precisely around that time when Lula went to Davos that Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the United Nations, also went to Davos for basically the same reasons. People were being convinced that the United Nations was becoming irrelevant because the real decisions were taken elsewhere, and because some of the biggest powers were, like, for example, through the creation of the World Trade Organization in the mid-90s as a body outside the United Nations, with the explicit decision to keep it outside of the United Nations, were taking key decisions outside of the UN and placing it elsewhere, where corporations had a lot of access. So Kofi Annan went to Davos and told to corporations, come to the UN, and created this so-called Global Compact, which is a set of some 10 principles that are voluntary and that corporations that declare that they follow them can join without much actual accountability as to whether they apply to that or not. That has evolved over time in different ways, but it was, in a sense, a clear decision by some of these global governance institutions, legitimate, legally binding global decision-making bodies, to start to invite corporations.
What we're also seeing on a global level is the increasing influence of big tech companies in governance decisions. Renata has some insight into the character of this influence.
It is a false sense of multi-stakeholder participation because, to be honest, tech companies participate at the table of decisions anyway, and they don't need to show up to the places where we are. They don't need to. They don't need our approval. They don't need our consent. They already do it. They could perfectly meet with the heads of state, and they have done it several times in private. And it's circus, it's just false sense, it's psychological. Because if they are at your table, you think that you're influencing them. And you think that you are participating in equal terms, when it is not the case. We have seen that the biggest lobbyist in Brussels is Google. We have seen how the big tech companies are the biggest lobbyists in Washington. So they have a play. They can walk through the door of heads of state directly. They don't need us to. They don't need to sit at the table with us. And I have seen, in the first years when the IGF or the fora were happening, they will send high up people. They will send really relevant people. Now we are just left with the leftovers, like the people showing up to these fora, like a really low-level executives. They're like more PR executives trying to, keep us happy, kind of. And it is. I think that also reflects on the meaningless character of those fora, because the decisions are happening somewhere else. And the power, you follow power, you follow the powerful people, and those meetings that, like the Munich Security Conference, for example, or these kind of fora, the fora where they are sitting at now, or at the emergency rooms on the health situation in countries dealing with COVID. We are left with the false sensation that something meaningful is happening, while everything has been decided elsewhere.
Barbara adds that philanthropy is also increasingly becoming an avenue for corporates to exert influence over global governance. She highlights how big tech has become an agenda setter of sorts for what problems we pay attention to and what we ignore.
One of the things I'd like to also add to this is the accompanying and related power of philanthropy, because it's not only big tech, although of course now we have Amazon, you know, the what is it, billions invested in the climate crisis. So one of the other enormous consequences of everything we're talking about is this pick and choose power on what problems we're going to take up and what problems we're going to ignore. So the environmental crisis is coming out tops. That's actually a lie. The climate crisis, in terms of its definition by emissions, but not biodiversity, is sort of top of the scale. So the other thing that big tech does is, on the one hand, it really shapes what our priorities are. In addition to that, it influences which ones we are going to take on as a society and which ones are getting left behind.
The WEF is one of the prominent players in the multi-stakeholder approach, and big tech has now joined its ranks. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the way global governance is being conceptualized and executed is fundamentally changing. Tune in to episode 3, where we'll investigate the pandemic's effect on various sectors, including agriculture, internet governance, sustainable development, and more, and look at the influence of transnational corporations on their policies. This has been episode 2 of the Davos Diaries, a podcast miniseries by Populi. Set up in 2018 by 7 organizations from across the globe, Populi is an alternative media platform that's reframing the conversation on digital justice and critically examining the new contours of our digitalizing world. Populi's founding members are the Latin American Information Agency, Data Justice Lab, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, Derechos Digitales, Internet Lab, IT for Change, and the JustNet Coalition. Engage with more of our work on botpopuli.net.